All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. First, I would like to say thank you to everyone who is tuning into this. I mean, like, to listen to something about kind of far out stories about science might not be everyone's cup of tea, but thank you for kind of just entertaining the subject here with me. Now, what we have going on is I have a copy here of the book A Crack in Creation, Gene Editing, and the Unthinkable Power to Control Evolution. This is by Dr. Jennifer Doudna and Dr. Samuel Sternberg. It actually has received a lot of praise from people like George Lucas, Walter Isaacson, who wrote the biographies of Steve Jobs, Henry Kissinger, and Albert Einstein, and Ariana Huffington are all on the back cover. And I was reading through this thing today, and I found some very interesting parts of the book. Like, they have just something here about genetically modified humans are made for great science fiction, but they are also a fertile subject for philosophical and ethical musings on the possibility of human self evolution. Well, even before we get to that stuff, let's talk a little about some scientists who have proposed genetically modifying human beings. One is H.S. Leong, Leong, and he has proposed something that is to make human beings more suitable for the planet Earth. We need to modify the DNA of humans, and the way we would do that is we need humans that cannot eat meat. That's the first thing. Have the ability to see at night and will be shorter. The reasons why for this is you would be consuming less organic material. If you're smaller, then you can live in smaller places and you don't need to build such large dwellings. And to see at night is you would be using less energy. I mean, right, and have to do all of these sorts of things to keep the house well lit and stuff. You wouldn't have to do any of that. And this is one of the reasons why I gave this upload his particular title. I would say that because is that something that is evil or is that something that is good? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And when they talk here about philosophical and ethical musings, I mean, like, I'm going to flat out tell you, I'm not quite sure about that one. I think that it's something that is very multi sided. I think there are people in the world that would erupt at the sound of some scientist altering someone's DNA so that they cannot eat meat anymore. And, like, I think that would just freak some people out. And even the concept of human beings getting night vision and being shorter would definitely scare some people, but I would love night vision, wouldn't you? I mean, the ability to see, like, you could just turn on your night vision. Oh, that sounds amazing. That's almost sounding like some superhero stuff right there. But this stuff really appears in different ways. And let's talk about some other things that are going on in the scientific world. Well, I used to be a writer for like some of those countdown sites, like top 10 this and top 10 that. I did some of that stuff years ago, and one of the things that I had been working on was outrageous conspiracy theories. And the number one most outrageous conspiracy that I could think of, and I wrote a piece about this years ago. It's probably not even on the internet anymore. Was that there actually is a cure for cancer, and it's being hidden from us by scientists. This is something that has been explored by just countless people up and down across the spectrum. You have the organic salesman saying that they've developed this organic cure for cancer and just people aren't taking it seriously. You have friend of a friend stories who say that someone who went to a Chinese acupuncture clinic in Ecuador found a way to cure cancer using, well, Chinese acupuncture. And I kid you not, that's true. A Chinese acupuncture clinic in Ecuador. I mean, I know it sounds kind of far out, but I mean, that's like a genuine story that it was presented to me, as well as some of the things that they're talking about in this book here, A Crack in Creation. In some of the earlier parts of the book, before what I just read out loud, they were discussing the possibility of just the Human Genome Project, looking at people's DNA for the future. sort of like when a baby is born, they would know that this baby could get cancer at and this is how it would happen, what type of cancer it would be. And what if you could modify the human DNA before it was born? And they're actually talking about a few things in this book, A Crack in Creation, that they would want to say about, like, they're really kind of raising some ethical red flags here, but I don't necessarily know why. To me, that seems kind of like a brilliant thing. I mean, like, if you could modify DNA, or you can, you modify genes to the point where someone would be born and there's no chance that they would get cancer. And it's not only that they're focusing in on something like cancer, also sickle cell anemia would be something that they would want to target like that. And here, let's have something from page 175 where they were saying a revolutionary form of cancer treatment. Immunotherapy is coming in three types: surgery, radiation, or chemotherapy. And the doctors have historically employed all of these. But now they want to bring in the new things. We talked about possibly editing someone's DNA and or like modifying their genes so that their children could not ever get cancer or sickle cell anemia. I mean, you could AIDS for something. We could do something like that. But one of the things here is that we have mild conspiracy theories, like the film Brzezinski, which is about a doctor named Stanislaus Brzezinski who came from Poland, and he had something called anti-neoplaston therapy, and that was something that was kind of an alternative to chemotherapy. Now, the way that anti-neoplaston therapy worked is it's an alternative, and they said that the remission rates, like if cancer were to go into remission, is only 9% for chemotherapy. It's like if somebody has cancer and they're on chemotherapy, only 9 out of 100 people are going to go into remission. And then there are also things like with anti-neoplastons, the remission rates, if I recall correctly, were up to 25%. And, it's like meaning that 25 out of every 100 people who was using this anti-neoplaston therapy that had been developed by Stanislaus Brzezinski would work. It's like he more than doubled the remission rates, almost tripled them. And they were like, there's a huge conspiracy to keep him down. The drug companies, the pharmaceutical industry, they're just so profitable that they just want to keep this guy under wraps. But I actually had a chance to talk to an oncologist about Dr. Brzezinski's film, which is simply just titled Brzezinski. I believe it's Bursynski, Brzezinski. I believe that. I mean, Polish names, excuse me. But it's like they were saying that the problem with that particular type of anti-neoplaston therapy is the film is a little bit misleading. Anti-neoplastons are used way more widely than they were leading on in the film. And the second thing is it's only suitable for certain types of cancer and certain types of tumors. But still, at the same time, though, I mean, that guy said if he more than doubled the remission rates, there might be a little bit more of things that are kind of hidden out from there, like that are hidden and not that well explored. But like, I really am curious why this book thinks that there is such an enormous ethical question about editing someone's DNA or modifying genes to the point where someone would have children and their children would not be able to ever get cancer or AIDS or sickle cell anemia or, I mean, for certain people, of course, and even some other things like, what about herpes? I mean, why not? Why not? And it's just like, I'm not completely sure about why things like that would be off limits. But some people though really go so far and they were just like, is this stuff necessary? Is this just like, is this just bankrupting us? And we even talked about the possibility that someone mentioned on a comment, and I used it in one of my previous uploads, about writing a blank check for biomedical science. And what people were saying though is that you can go too far with DNA modifications and gene editing. Sorry, DNA editing, gene modifications. Those things can go too far, and like they talk about you know, modifying the genes of plants, like editing the DNA of plants to make them stronger so that plants won't die in, a famine, and like they won't die and they won't like get ravaged by locusts and stuff like that. And I mean, people from the agricultural sector could just look at that and be like, you want to help plants? They need things like water and sunlight and maybe mulch, fertilizer, something like manure, something of that nature. And that's just what you have to do. It's just like the age old natural remedies also work very, very well. So, like when you talk about modifying, kind of the genetic structures of plants or whatnot, or I mean, like if I'm using that word incorrectly, modifying the kind of molecular structure of plants, the DNA of plants, and it's just like they really want to just have a massive overhaul of botany in general, and they're just like, that's totally impractical. With something like that, it just has to be done with the age-old natural remedies: water, sunlight, and plant food. But when you're dealing with human beings, there's a very big difference here. The difference is that human beings are dealing with things like cancer and AIDS, and we mentioned sickle cell anemia for certain people, and as well as some other things, just anemia in general. Like, what if you could get rid of all of these things via some of this, you know, germline manipulation and stuff? Well, what I would say is that I think that it should all be possible. Is any of this stuff suppressed? Well, if it were truly suppressed, they wouldn't have written a book about it and like. But what I would say is though, this stuff about here, gene editing and the unthinkable, I'd say that it's still somewhat in its infancy to the point where they this stuff is just in its infancy, like to modify someone's genes to the point where they would have children and their children would never be able to get cancer. That stuff hasn't reached its sort of penultimate level. What I think is really going to be happening is that you can sort of do a little bit more blood work on children when they're first born, and they can learn how to control certain aspects of their neurological development and biological development as a whole. We can just call that biological development, can be controlled with nutrition and dieting that can lead to a certain outcome. And it's like, but even here on page 188, they're talking about it's not as if the debate over modifying the human germline began only when gene editing came along. Far from it. Back when earliest hints of gene editing were emerging, physicians in reproductive medicine were already selecting certain embryos over others for establishing pregnancies, thus making choices about what genetics would be propagated to subsequent generations, and even longer. And even for longer, practitioners and observers of science have been disturbed by the notion that humans might someday be the primary authors of their own genetic constitutions. Now, okay, I think I can gather some of what they're saying. I don't know, maybe something like that, and they think that this could be political. But there's an earlier part in the book that I was reading earlier today about how they were talking once politics gets into science, it's horribly detrimental. And they have sort of a convincing case for that. I mean, even when you hear something like that we just read there, I mean, that's stuff that's dealing with levels of political correctness as well as just politics in general, identity politics across the spectrum, and something like that could definitely be more of a red flag. Once the role of DNA in encoding genetic information had been proved, researchers began to appreciate the power of rationally manipulating genetic code, even though the tools for doing so didn't yet exist. Well, it's like we're still working on it now. I mean, they are working on it. They're the geneticists, that is. But the thing is, we really have a big opportunity here. Do you think that this is something that is going to be going to what H.S. Leong talked about how we could modify human DNA to the point where humans would no longer be able to eat meat and see in the dark and be smaller, so they would require a smaller living space? I mean, like, is this what we're actually going to be dealing with? But at the same time, we also had that stuff from Marshall McLuhan way back when, talking about how human beings are going to become one with the machines, and sort of like, cyborgs. I mean, that's kind of the definition of a cyborg, right? Something that is part machine and part human. And like, is that also going to be the future? And then would that be something that we could explore as a ways to eliminate cancer and AIDS and herpes? Yeah, that was our other example. I'm not 100% certain what's going to happen in the future, but what I would say about this stuff is that there is potential that this could really change a lot of human society, but it really could just change the entirety of human development. But what I would say about this is we really probably aren't yet there. As far as the alternative treatments for cancer and things of that nature, I mean, hemp oil was another one we didn't get to talk about. I mean, hemp oil is something that's been mentioned a lot over the years as sort of a an alternative treatment to any form that we mentioned, radiation, surgery, or chemotherapy. But one of the things is, through my own independent research, I really found that hemp oil and just marijuana, cannabis, those things are really focused on removing the pain, and they're removing the sort of kind of the dolorous aspects of the cancer process. And we always have to be very, very careful when people are trying to sell you something. Like, for example, what is it with HIV or something? One out of every 100 people has a natural ability to combat HIV. So sometimes they might test the drugs on 1,800 people, and then they'll be like 18 people are cured. Wow, look at this. But in reality, that's just the person got better on their own. And with cancer, the things that you find are more indicative of spontaneous remission, and those things can happen. So we always have to be very careful when we're listening to the alternative salesman. I mean, it's true. And in the friend of a friend stories, like had about, the Chinese acupuncture clinic in Ecuador, a lot of that stuff hasn't really been scrutinized to the point where it's very verifiable. But at the same time, I look forward to examining a world where we can entertain possibilities of genetic editing to the point where people would be born and they would just have no chance of having cancer or AIDS or herpes in the future. What do you expect? What do you think that gene modification can do, this gene editing? And also, what do you think about the sort of things like we talked about with H.S. Leong, modifying DNA so people would change their lifestyles? What do you have to say? If you have anything to say at all, drop a comment below. Thank you so much.